Good morning, hackers. Well, today I'm going to be talking about the rise of ransomware. A little bit about myself. I am a malware researcher at FishMe, and one of my passions dealing with malware is taking a look at those malware families that utilize PHP panels and finding vulnerabilities within that particular malware command and control. Some of my hobbies include playing the drums and listening to music. And as you mentioned, every now and then I'll tweet out things from @Hexlax, so feel free to hit me up on there or my work email. Let's go over our agenda for today. So we'll talk about what is ransomware, some common practices regardless of the family, and we'll also dive into three particular families. You may have heard about these in the news recently, being CryptoWall, TeslaCrypt, and Locky. We'll also talk about some mitigation steps, and not only that the end user or residential user can implement, but also what you can do within your organization. And finally, also have a video demo of a live infection that I recorded for you. First, a little disclaimer though. Anytime that you play with malware, make sure you're doing it in a properly segmented lab. Don't be the one that infects your organization. And this presentation may contain links, so if you have your laptop, your mobile phone in the audience, please don't visit those, because that wouldn't be good for you. All right, so what is ransomware? Ransomware is a type of malware that restricts access to the infected computer system in some way, most notably usually through some type of file encryption process. And the way that the malware actors are monetizing that is that they will restrict that access back to that file, usually with some type of digital currency that the victim has to pay, usually in Bitcoin. So show of hands, who here has been ravaged by ransomware, either their home computers or the organization? I know Lance had mentioned that he got popped earlier. Yeah, you know somebody. Usually, I gave this talk not too long ago in Birmingham, and quite a few hands went up over there. And I was like, okay, well, leave your hand in the air if you paid the ransom. And everyone's like, yeah, kind of not really wanting to admit it. But unfortunately, I mean, there's really no other way to get those files back. I mean, it's very strong cryptography and encryption that they're utilizing to hold those files ransom. You may have heard about these events recently in the news. Hollywood Presbyterian Medical Center, February of 2016, paid a ransom of 40 Bitcoins, roughly at the time $17,000 US. So you can read about that incident. They actually released a memo on their website. It's pretty interesting. And Methodist Hospital in Henderson, Kentucky, March of 2016, they declared an internal state of emergency due to a Locky infection. Screenshot of their website with that huge red banner at the top saying that we've got popped by ransomware. This was brought to light by Krebs, Brian Krebs, his website, Krebs on Security. And like I mentioned earlier, organizations, they might have no choice but to pay that ransom, especially if it's business critical files that have been encrypted. Some common practices, regardless of the ransomware family, encrypts files with very strong asymmetric crypto. So even if you had all of the computing resources within the world, it would still take you hundreds, if not thousands of years to break this type of cryptography. Most of these families that I'll go over, they utilize the onion router or Tor for command and control, relaying victim instructions, and also the back-end databases that handle payment verification. Deletes shadow copies and Windows snapshots. So yeah, as you can imagine, you want to prohibit the user from rolling back from previous file snapshots, so they usually just delete those out. What we have also seen too is that some of the lesser known variants that are just now coming into the wild, they might masquerade or pretend to be a more well-known CryptoWall or crypto ransomware family, mainly to entice that user that in the event that they pay, that they will get their files back. Most of these are installed via exploit kits, be it drive-by download attacks or massive spam campaigns. And one other thing that we've seen is that most of these families, they prioritize network shares over local drives, right? So as you can imagine, within an organization, some of these malware families, they're wanting to encrypt those files located on network shares prior to worrying about files on local drives. Main reason being, that's obviously going to affect more people, and that organization is probably more willing to pay that ransom to get those files back. And as mentioned earlier too, accepts digital currency, usually Bitcoin. So let's explore 3 of the notorious families in the news. First one being CryptoWall. So the latest version of this was version 4.0, first seen in November of 2015. And although recently, in the media, they kind of portray this as being a very new threat, but CryptoWall obviously has been around for a while. So it's definitely not a new issue when it comes to ransomware. The way that this infects the system is processed by process hollowing or DLL injection, usually into Explorer or SVC host.exe, and also has reboot persistence via registry run key. Encrypts the file names and files with a very strong RSA 2048 key. Deletes the shadow copies, as most of them do. And there's some actor attribution behind this particular family. The author of Hyman Exploit Kit was doxxed, and what they noticed is that the development of Hyman dropped as soon as CryptoWall came out. So the idea being that this particular author stopped doing exploit kit development and then went on to ransomware. First seen as CryptoLocker clone in November of 2013, and the actors actually abandoned the back end. So right now, although there might be some variants that are still being spread in the wild of CryptoWall, the back-end panel or the database that handles monetary transactions to verify ransom payments completely down, so it's no longer really a threat. But as we've seen with previous crimeware families, especially Zeus, that the source code leak of that has spawned several variants. So we're definitely keeping our ear to the ground to see if that's the case, as law enforcement is closing in on this guy because of the doxing of the particular author. Here's a little snapshot here of the version history, and this was taken from CryptoWallTracker.org. It's a very good website if you want to learn more about CryptoWall. Has quite a few things about the family and attribution as well. First started in November 2013, as I said, as CryptoLocker clone, renamed itself Crypto Defense, and then in March of 2014, we have CryptoWall version 4. Oh, I'm sorry, CryptoWall version 1 started. One of the pretty funny things that you can take a look at as far as attribution is concerned is to see which countries are excluded from execution for these particular families. And as you can see here, the map, mostly the Russian, kind of gives way to the attribution of this particular family. Here's a little snapshot of a typical campaign overview, including the infrastructure hitting CryptoWall. So usually a JS downloader is included in a zip archive that's attached to an email. And I'll go more into the JavaScript downloaders here in a minute. That's massively spammed out, and poor granny clicks on that and infects her computer. That's then communicating with PHP proxy, which is usually just one flat PHP file hosted on a compromised website, which then again creates like a curl wrapper for any post information that's sent, forwards that back to another proxy server, usually Provoxy or Nginx, and then that gets forwarded back to the Tor hidden web service. Here's an actual example of a email lure that dropped CryptoWall. So information regarding your order and promotional offer can be found in the attachment below, again with a zip archive attachment. Zip archive contains a .js file, which when double-clicked on Windows, executes just like a .exe. So this is actually obfuscated JavaScript that's executed by Windows scripting host, and it's usually heavily obfuscated. This downloader then reaches out usually to another compromised site or a Nginx proxy that hosts the second stage payload. And once that executes, it does a series of check-ins over HTTP post. So pictured right is the actual PHP backend source code for this particular file. And as you can see on line 2, they just statically hard code the IP address of that third tier Nginx proxy that would then communicate to the Tor hidden web service backend. The cool thing, though, since this is over HTTP, being a plain text protocol, there are some really good suricata hits or signatures that emerging threat post, even in their free version. ET Trojan CryptoWall check-in, as you can see the screenshot down at the bottom there in a squeal GUI. And this is what our poor grandma sees on her desktop. So not only does it pop up a image file .png within the Windows photo viewer of the instructions on how she can get her files decrypted, but also usually drops a HTML file which is rendered in the background there in the default browser with the same instructions. So as I mentioned earlier, Jonathan here tweeted out March 28th that he noticed the back end monitoring. Jonathan being the actual curator of CryptoWallTracker.org, so he'd been monitoring this particular crew for a while and noticed that the back end completely went down. As you can see down at the bottom graph from ransomware.abuse.ch, they track several crypto ransomware families. So a really cool website to get a little bit better idea of how far spread this particular threat is. So definitely check them out. And it's in sharp decline. There was probably one blimp there at April 27th, but if I had to guess, I was probably just some researcher that was messing around. Any questions so far on CryptoWall? Yeah.
You say the backend's down, so if somebody's files are currently encrypted, there's SOL?
Yeah, that's the case. But as far as I understand this particular family, it does do a check-in prior to encrypting. So in the event that this is still being spread by some automated spam campaign that was set up way back, yeah, well, yeah. At least it won't be infecting your computer or encrypting the files at least. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
I have a very basic question.
Okay. I like those.
Because this is new to me. Why is it impossible to get out of it? Like, why do you have to pay it?
Yeah, that's a good question.
I understand you need your files and everything, but
Yeah.
why isn't there a solution?
Yeah, I mean, the problem is that they're utilizing encryption that is mathematically sound. And what I'll go over in one of the families, there are some vaccinations or even some bugs within the implementation of that. So it's not usually that the encryption's flawed, that someone can break the encryption, because that's not the case. It's that how that was implemented, right? What we'll see with Locky, and I'll talk about this here in a minute, there was a trick you could populate a particular registry key with a public key to which you already have the private key for. So in the event that you're infected with Locky, you already have that private key pair and could decrypt your files. So there's usually bugs or vaccinations that's due to the implementation, but not necessarily a flaw or a 0-day within the encryption itself. All right, moving on to TeslaCrypt. So the current version right now is actually 4.2, and this was released or seen in the wild just as recently as April 28th. Encrypts files with a very strong RSA key of 4096. And yeah, we kind of touched on this earlier. So version 3 had a bug within its implementation that allowed you to decrypt the files that was published by Talos, which Talos Intel, I think they were bought out by Cisco recently. So you were able to get your files back, but sure enough, not even like a month after that, these guys went ahead and patched it with their release of version 4.0, so that decoder tool no longer works. Persistence, again, through reboots via registry run key, And this has been seen dispersed in the wild via the Angler exploit kit, and of course your massive mouse spam campaigns. But this family was also first seen in March of 2015, so this has been around for a while as well. Here's a snapshot of the version history. So again, starting in March of 2015 is when we first seen version 1 of TeslaCrypt, and version 2 kicking off in November of 2015. And then from there, it looks like they're pivoting to almost like a bi-monthly release cycle, like even scheduled almost. So although you have minor versions that were released the past couple weeks, we'll probably see version 5 here in the next couple weeks. So yeah.
Is that because version 1 was so successful they were able to start paying developers?
Yeah, that could be the case. Yeah. That could definitely be the case. Yeah, I'm not really sure why that sped the development up. I guess, yeah, as more people are buying their kit, because this is like a ransomware as a service, that they're able to spend more resources on development. Yeah.
It's like a group of culprits who are doing this.
Yeah, usually. And I like to think of it as mimicking the actual software companies. So you have your teams for development, you have a team for distribution, marketing, sales, and support. So yeah, it's,
And when you showed the map of like the former Soviet nation, like West Asian Central,
yeah.
so they're untouched by this. Is that what you're saying?
Well, so the going theory is if you're a malware author and residing in those countries, that you know better than to attack your motherland. That foreign attacks is a little bit not as watched as closely, I guess, compared to if you're trying to attack the country that you reside in. So that's a good question. Yeah.
So why, and you may talk about this, but why doesn't Microsoft or someone at the OS level, it's because it mimics, regular encryption that we would want to use on our systems, is why they can't block it at the OS level?
Yeah, they do utilize. The question was I guess from like a host detection standpoint, in the event that you saw this encryption routine that's being performed, why can't you block that? But yeah, most of these are utilizing the Windows API type of keys, from what I believe, and that's how they encrypt the files. As far as AV detecting it, I mean, there's from these fresh campaigns that I see every day, there's usually zero detection, at least running it through like static signature on a virus total. So very low detection as far as AV is concerned. Yeah.
Two questions. One, back to kind of the organization level. I vaguely remember reading that like they actually have like in some cases like customer support departments that will help you like get on a tour and like pay them Bitcoin and all that shit. Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And they don't offer it right now, but I've heard of a couple researchers. TeslaCrypt in some of the earlier versions had a support number that you could call to get assistance with purchasing Bitcoin. And there's some pretty phone calls that have been recorded for that, trying to social engineer a little bit more information out of these guys. But they're probably just a call center that these guys hired. I doubt they had any direct monetary ties with the actual actors.
I'm sorry, I had a second question. You had mentioned they're distributed by exploit kits.
Yeah.
That's like a JavaScript package, right? That kind of manages the drive-by download distribution.
Yeah, absolutely. So an exploit kit is it's a custom piece of software ran by a malicious actor that, in the event through normal user browsing, exploits a known vulnerability within a browser session. From there, the idea is that once you have code execution, they're dropping the malware and running that. So it's just used as a means of distribution. Okay. Another question? Good. Okay. So it's still very prevalent. Even though the past couple weeks we've seen a little bit of a decline, with TeslaCrypt, and I think that might be attributed. Some of the same forms where this particular variant is being marketed has also been marketed for Cerber, which is fairly new ransomware. I just started playing with it the past couple weeks. So I think some of the actors that were playing with TeslaCrypt have maybe have moved on to Cerber right now. So definitely start paying more attention to that family as well. But still very prevalent. Taking a look at the typical campaign overview, including the infrastructure. So less intermediary nodes for this family. The JavaScript attachment attached to an email on a massive mouse spam campaign. Granted gets that email, clicks on the attachment, executes the second stage downloader. And that then in turn communicates with a PHP proxy. Again, another compromised website, usually hacked WordPress or some other type of CMS that then forwards that information to backend, again, another Tor hidden web service. Here's another live example from our sample set. This one attempting to lure the user into believing that it was an unsuccessful Western Union transfer. So you have received a money transfer for the amount of, however much US dollars via Western Union, and a warning letter zip attachment. So that zip archive, of course, again, has a JS. And by the way, I mean, although JS seems to be a popular choice for some of these campaigns at the moment, we've also seen malicious Office documents that have macros enabled. So if that user clicks allow macro, then it's going to fire off and grab that second stage executable as well. Yeah, question?
I was looking at a TeslaCrypt infection a few weeks back, and there was a shockwave file, a JavaScript file, and probably an HTML file that were all infected. What was the order that would have come in? It looked like the source was like an infected head from a table. But like I didn't get to the bottom of which came first.
Yeah, my guess is since that sounds like it was more of a web-based infection, that was probably coming from an exploit kit, which that would be my guess. But yeah, the way that the exploit kits work, and we kind of touched on this earlier, is that in the event that a user is browsing a website, it might be silently redirected to an exploit kit, and if the user's operating system or third-party plugins like Flash and whatnot are not updated, then it exploits a vulnerability that will then drop whatever type of malware that exploit kit user has set up to be dropped. Okay. So again, yeah, heavily obfuscated JavaScript for the second stage downloader. That then downloads it, and you can see in the headers that for the return in the stream, I believe this one's actually Nginx. Yeah, it's Nginx proxy that was hosting second stage payloads.
Did you have any type of restriction on accessing that, like host header checking or?
As far as restrictions in place where? Or?
Like to actually download the second stager? Was there anything coming from the infection?
Oh yeah, as far as like maybe geo restrictions or.
Or something in the host header itself or something like that?
Yeah, some of the PHP files that handle the second stage download, they might check user agent strings, or I've seen geolocation as well. They'll also place I have seen .htaccess files with long list of IP subnets that might block known security vendors or virus total. Actually, I just looked at one of those the other day, and within the PHP code, it was looking for the user agent of virus total. So apparently, anytime that virus total is attempting to grab a second stage, it has like its Google Cloud user agent, and I have seen that blocked in some of these. So again, this family as well, it checks in with HTTP post to a compromised website that's hosting this PHP file, source code pictured right. The cool thing about this one, though, is that it actually forwards it back to the Tor backend, usually through some type of Tor to web gateway, as you can see on line 15 in that source code. This is the Tor hidden gateway addresses there. And since we're over HTTP again, very strong suricata hits provided to us by emerging threat, ET Trojan, AlphaCrypt, TeslaCrypt, Ransomware, CNC Beacon, and Beacon Response. And this is what our poor granny sees on her desktop. PNG file pops up in photo viewer with the instructions on how to decrypt and pay the ransom. And of course the HTML file displaying in default browser. Any questions so far on TeslaCrypt? Yeah. That seems to be the question was, do they always use Tor prior to encryption or the callbacks? Most of the families do, but actually with Cerber, even if you do not have a network connection, it will go ahead and encrypt your files. So that's one difference. But yeah, most of these families, they'll attempt to do their check-in first to get kind of instructions, I guess, from the C2, and then they'll start encrypting. But what I've seen with Cerber, that's not the case. Yeah.
So Paul, going back to that, you said we're pretty good with all of our clients as far as stopping it, getting private key.
Yeah.
In that case where it does kind of bring it back up to them,
Mhm.
and it has a private key with the infection,
Yeah.
are you able then, in your space, to be able to locate that private key within the original malware and then encrypt the files?
Most of those, so in prior versions to some of these families, that was an issue, that the executable or the ransomware loader also had a private key, which may have existed in memory at some point, so you could snapshot and hopefully get that key out of memory to decrypt in the event that your organization was popped. But what we're seeing now is that these miscreants per campaign are solely using private key, and that's not being forwarded out to the clients at all. So the same public key might be in use for the entire campaign, but that private key never touches the box that it's infecting. It's only residing back end on their back end services.
So if we go staple firewall and you can call back to get that private key, we've had that with a number of clients that
I see.
get the infection that we never get encrypted because it can't get back to where it needs to go.
Oh, I see that. That's a good point.
Some of these that they do bring a private key,
Right.
able to extrapolate that from.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely means of as long as you can do like a memory dump and extract keys from that method. Yeah. Mhm. Mainly using volatility for that kind of stuff. Yeah. Yep.
So if the system is calling back to the Tor node and they don't have Tor installed on their computer, then do they have methods of like blocking this?
Yeah, some of the initial families they weren't utilizing the Tor to web gateways, so you would have to. There were instructions within the ransomware decryption that you have to go out and download the Tor browser to be able to actually get to the payment information or the payment portal. But most of these families now they're going to just drop the instructions, and the victim user would not have to utilize Tor themselves. That's just a method that they're utilizing to hide their backend infrastructure. Yeah.
So have there any products that can riskily detect like if a large amount of files are changing on dicks to random data and it's being affected by ransomware? I think that's a rather easy thing to detect actually.
Yeah, someone else, within the AV sec could probably answer that better. All I know is that AV's dead, at least from my viewpoint.
The problem
But
is that when it does detect it, it's already encrypted. Like what it's
Right.
detecting is the process of it being encrypted, so you're already toast.
right,
So I've heard some people that have been able to stop it at some point in the process, but pretty much what, like even Tripwire or any of those types of file system change detection utilities are going to tell you that it's happening, and you're going to find it faster, but you're still hosed. Yeah, there isn't, unless then you still have to recover whatever you didn't stop. So I would say like it's a mitigation, but it's not really the it's
Right.
not even really mitigation, really. I mean, you should be doing that anyways. But,
I guess I think of time on the computer.
well, that is a problem. Some of them do hibernate. Like some of the latest ones, the Mac ransomware that came
Yeah.
out actually waited so many days before it would activate. So I mean, they're getting very tricky. But
Yeah.
Have you seen any of the back-end infrastructures grow with the amount of samples that you're going across, like as they increase?
Yeah, absolutely. So the question was the backend infrastructure increasing as the amount of samples? Since most of these families are actually like a ransomware as a service, we have, it's not necessarily that the malicious actor that's setting up these campaigns, they're standing up their own infrastructure. That's provided to them by the people that are selling the ransomware as a service. But we have seen, more middle nodes, or like burner nodes, some of those like Nginx proxies. So instead of like hard coding 3 or 4 IP addresses, they might do 5 or 6 just to have a little bit more of a nodes that they can burn.
Yeah, so they're bringing an engineer as well to scale.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I haven't seen it in AWS yet, but I'm waiting for it. Yeah.
Oh, we're on EC2.
Yeah. Cool. Yeah.
Earlier when you had the diagram, which was the release cadence over time,
Mhm.
does that impact, like if you wrote a YAR rule that would identify the binary, because those are new releases every 2 weeks, does that mean the rules are out of date?
Yeah. As far as on the actual executable itself, or what would the scope of the YAR rule be against?
Anything you scan, anything that you would scan would come in initial. If you're looking for like the actual executable, I guess the attachment.
Yeah.
So I guess if they're releasing every 2 weeks, the rules are gonna be out of date.
Yeah, that's true. Especially with the actual executable itself, even from second stage payload that might be coming back. If you're running YAR against that, those are heavily packed. And that's the reason why AV detection is failing, is due to packed executable code. So yeah, it's really hard to see that. So not only is that every 2 weeks they're patching bugs within the actual ransomware malware itself, but the packers that they utilize, I see within the same campaign they might have 20 distinct hashes of an executable that they utilize, and that would be a relatively small campaign. Yeah.
If you have what you think may be a sample, is there a way that you can determine what it is and what family without executing it?
Without executing it, that's really tough, mainly because of the issue with packing. So like as an end user though,
I'm talking as a security team, we capture some of these in our spam filter.
yeah,
We would like to know what they are.
right.
For JavaScript attachments, but we don't necessarily want to start executing.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's actually one thing that my company works on, not to do any type of plugin or anything. Our analysts, what they do is they take a look at, what are some of the massive mouse spam campaigns per day, and they'll pull down the malware, analyze that, and we release that as threat indicators that you may have seen in some of the email slides. It'll say, threat ID number. So the idea being, after a while, we've detected enough signatures that we can pinpoint, all right, well, this particular email has this indicator in it, and we know that this has been a CryptoWall dropper or a TeslaCrypt dropper campaign in the past. So we can, create signatures around that. That way, you just solely looking at the email and some of the YARA signatures or signatures that are written for that particular campaign, you already know that that's what the first stage or the second stage payload could be. Does that make sense? Cool. Yeah, absolutely. So virus total, most reverse engineers too, that at least the ones that I work with, we're constantly commenting on virus total. So if you have a secure means of checking the hash of that malware sample, you might not be able to trust the initial JS droppers that are included in the attachments, just because they switch up so often. There's so many per campaign, but that second stage payload hash doesn't change up as often per campaign. So if you can get a hold of that, get a hash, and look that up on VirusTotal. Most researchers, they've been pretty good about commenting on VirusTotal as far as what type of malware family that could be. Good question. All right. Moving on to Locky. And Locky is also spread via massive mouse spam campaigns with either doc macros, Office doc macros, or JavaScript downloaders. It's also being seen dropped as the final payload for neutrino and Angler exploit kits. Again, reboot persistence via registry run key. And some of the earlier versions that were pushed out with Locky, they actually placed some tracking information within the registry at HK current user software /Locky. So it was very easy to see that key in there. And I'll talk about that here in a minute, some of the mitigation steps that their team then pushed out as far as changes. Deletes shadow file copies, of course, encrypts data with a very strong AES 128, and first appeared on the scene about mid-February of 2016. So show of hands, who here is familiar with Dridex banking Trojan? Quite a few people, okay. For those not in the know, Dridex is a man-in-the-browser banking Trojan. What that means is that as a user's computer is infected with Dridex, anytime that they're visiting a website that's included in the Dridex configuration file, JavaScript is going to be immediately injected into that browser session to, usually to retrieve credentials. One cool capability is that this actually started with Zeus Banking Trojan, is a VNC connectback capability. So as financial institutions, they start to do more like fraud detection, and they notice that Grandma Joe initiated an account transfer from Ohio, but then not even an hour later, a much larger transaction occurred from Ukraine. So that's always going to set off fraud alerts. So the way that the miscreants are combating that is to utilize a VNC connectback to that infected Grandma Joe's machine and initiating those account transfers directly from her computer. So a little bit harder to detect as far as fraud detection within the FI. So a pretty cool piece. The reason why I mentioned Dridex here is because there's been a very strong connection between Dridex botnet 220 and Locky affiliate IDs 1 and 3. So we're seeing some of the same distribution methods utilized for those families. And there's also been some researchers that have monitored Dridex Banking Trojan for long-term deployments. And what they've noticed is that the running theory, is that since these research computers are not really being utilized for banking, and they're not the miscreants aren't gaining any type of credentials from that. So instead of just moving on from that infected endpoint, one last ditch effort to monetize that infection is to drop Locky. So people have been seeing that in long-term Dridex infections. Here's a very small snapshot of about 3,000 unique source IP addresses. So these are IP addresses that downloaded the second stage payload. Second stage in this particular campaign being the after the victim clicks the JavaScript executable, it then reaches out to a second stage payload, which grabs the Locky loader. So source IP addresses that were downloading this particular campaign. So taking a look at that map, as you can see, it's pretty geographically dispersed, except for one country. Anyone take a guess? Russia, right? Yeah. I mean, there's one red blip there, and that, if I had to take a guess, that was probably some researcher that was downloading second stage through some type of like VPN solution. So pretty much the same actor attribution as most of these coming out of Russia. Here's an example of a live email lure that we've seen in the wild. This one, again, being a some type of invoice lure. Please review the attached copy of your invoice in air cargo copy within the zip attachment. And of course has a JavaScript downloader. Heavily obfuscated, and again is ran just like a .exe when a user double clicks on it via Windows scripting host. reaches out and grabs the second stage payload. For Locky, most of the distributions, especially for affiliate ID 1 and 3, second stage payloads are being hosted on compromised websites. For each campaign, we usually see anywhere from about 10 to 20 compromised websites, and these are burnt every day. So new compromised websites are being utilized for each campaign, usually about 10 to 20 URLs for that. So that's downloaded and executed. And a little bit different setup for Locky. So there's usually 3 or 4 hard-coded IP addresses within this loader that it builds a URL around that. Some of the earlier versions, it was posting a URL to main.php. Then that was changed up to submit, and then most recently, as of like a couple weeks ago, they switched to userinfo.php. So again, since we're over plain text protocol, very strong signatures for an emerging threat that you can get for that. Trojan, ransomware, Locky, CNC beacon. Oh, and also one other thing I failed to mention here in the slide deck is that although there's 3 or 4 hard-coded IP addresses, Locky also has a fallback domain generation algorithm, or DGA, and that seed value changes up weekly. So unfortunately, as a researcher, you might be able to predict a couple days out what the DGA domains might be. They then change that seed value the next week in a different campaign. So very hard to predict those from long-term sinkholing. And poor Granny Joe, this is what she's getting on her desktop now. So not only does it pop up the image instructions in a photo viewer, but also sets the desktop background as those instructions as well, just to make sure you don't miss them, I guess. All right, so kind of touched on this earlier with the nice lady's question about prevention or vaccinations. And just like any other type of software system, the lack of proper programming and lack of quality of assurance leads to bugs. So there was a registry lock via an ACL that you could implement. So by setting a particular registry key, I mentioned it earlier, it was that HKCU software Locky. So if you set like a read-only attribute as an admin, when Locky initially executes, it attempts to read that, and due to improper exception handling, would just crap out and would not infect your system. So one of my fellow coworkers initially found this bug, and then like 2 weeks later, a Lexi consulting firm publicly blogged about it. And of course, like within the matter of 3 days, we saw that was patched immediately in the wild. So pretty interesting to see that these guys are performing OSINT on their their malware. And in the event that there's some type of public information that's published, they're obviously reading that and reacting very quickly in the development life cycle of that malware. So pretty interesting to see that in the wild. So one other method that you can use to not get infected by Locky is just go ahead and setting your operating system language to Russian. I don't know how usable it would be then, but that is one method. And there was also that same registry key too. Although that has been patched around March 29th with the registry lock crash and the setting a completed registry key. That particular registry key is still based on the computer name, so it can still be computed. So the same patch exists, but just not at the easier statically coded registry key. It's unique per machine. And as I mentioned earlier too, Lexi published how you might be able to populate that RSA public key already on a machine. So in the event that you are infected with Locky, the idea being that you have a key pair for that public key that you can go ahead and decrypt your files. So one other method of vaccinating yourself. Yeah.
Like, would this apply to anything you have saved in the cloud, like pictures and things like that?
That's a good question. So the question was, how would this apply to anything that's saved in the cloud? And
Like your iCloud or something.
yeah, so I'm not sure if Depends how it's mapped. I know one of my fellow coworkers. He was given a live infection demo, and the way that he transferred malware samples into his VM was through a network share. So Locky was intuitive enough to scan other network shares and found that his Dropbox was mapped to his local machine, and then started encrypting our company's Dropbox. But yeah, it was pretty funny. We gave him shit for a while about that. But the cool thing about cloud storage is that they have very good backups. So it was very easily, it was just like one phone call, and they reverted everything back prior to encrypting those files. Yeah, that's a good question though. All right, we talk a little bit about mitigation, and we've already kind of touched a bit on this. Keep your environment patched first and foremost. So not only keeping Internet Explorer up to date, your OS level when updates, but also all of your third-party plugins to prevent third-party drive-by attacks with exploit kits. So all of your Adobe Flashes, Java, PDF, pretty much anything that's web-based on your machine. One other thing that you can do is block executable scripts on gateways. I have no idea why .js files within a zip archive are allowed through email gateways. I cannot think of any business reason why that would be legit. Yeah, why .zips at all? Yeah, is that how you deploy code? Yeah. So even if your developers come back and say, well, that's how we patch things, I don't know. I think there would be more secure ways to transfer that type of stuff within an organization. One other thing that you should definitely be doing, not only for your home computer, but also within your organization, is back up and practice those disaster recovery drills, first and foremost. So it's not only that you have 3, 2, 1 backups, but also having your practice drills in the event that our HR guys are able to encrypt with ransomware all of our development source code. How does that impact our business, and how do we quickly get back to operational status? So you should be able to answer that fairly quickly and know the timetable that would take to occur. Train users to spot fish first and foremost. It's the idea of, especially the company that I'm at, training your users to become an asset as opposed to a liability. So definitely seeing that, and only as they report things, but how is that acted upon within your security operations center? One pretty cool tool that's published by Bitdefender is anti-ransomware, so you might want to check out that. I would not recommend that for the enterprise. As I was playing with it, even after the Locky patches, it does prevent Locky from infecting. But what I have noticed is that it updates over HTTP, plain text. So it reaches out, and grabs an executable and updates. So you probably think of some type of man-in-the-middle scenario for that in the organization. But at least for Grandma Joe's computer, I'm probably going to install that on there for her. Also, definitely want to implement least privilege access based on user business roles. There's no reason why your HR or your sales team has complete read-write on your dev source trees, right? And starting to wrap up a little bit, just want to go over some final thoughts of what I'm currently working on and what I'll be concentrating on in the future. As I kind of mentioned earlier, the malware ecosystem is starting to mimic legit software. You have your support, your sales, marketing, distribution, and even your development team. One thing within some of these ransomware instruction sets, you'll see that it prompts the user or instructs the user to reach out to particular Bitcoin exchanges where they might be able to utilize their PayPal account to exchange that for Bitcoin. Have those exchanges been looked at? With all the amount of money that's moving around with Bitcoin from ransomware, I bet these exchanges are getting a nice cut of that action. So I haven't seen too much research out on the exchanges themselves. And of course, there's a huge rise of ransomware. All these families that we talked about here, they're marketing on underground forums. So people can hire that. They don't have to stand up the infrastructure to start these campaigns. They're solely just renting that service. And then from there, it's left up to them to hire maybe a spammer or a distributor to massively spam out those campaigns. One other pretty cool facet that I came across with ransomware while researching this stuff is it's being used to cover up corporate intrusions. So some of your advanced persistent threat, I know, don't throw anything at me. I mentioned APTs. Some of these guys, they've been in the network for 2 or 3 years. They've exfilled every bit that they could have, possibly get out of an organization. So one last ditch effort maybe to monetize that foothold that they have on an organization is to drop ransomware. That probably maybe tips the hat as far as detection is concerned. Because these guys, I think it was the SecureWorks article, is pretty neat that they distributed ransomware out to via like Active Directory somehow, maybe WSUS or whatever its successor is, to all the computers on the network. But they found out, after coming in and investigating that these guys had been in the network for 2 or 3 years already. So. And some future work that I'll be taking a look at personally. Identify more family vulnerabilities, especially playing in with the community control infrastructure backend. Cerber, which is fairly new, first seen in the wild around March 10th. So starting to play with that now. And of course, any type of one project that I kind of came up with and maybe wanted to run this by y'all to see what thoughts were on this is taking a look at long-term monitoring. So after a user is infected, they pay the ransom, and that doesn't, these guys aren't removing the malware from the computer. So the reason why they paid the ransom in the first place, the victim, is because they don't have solid backups, and the data that they was encrypted isn't important enough for them to pay the ransom. So they're probably not wiping the computers, removing all traces of the malware. This malware is still communicating, back C2. So that's one thing that I would like to play with. Perhaps maybe access, to that infected node is sold to a third party. Could be the case, or as later versions of particular malware family come out, does it reinfect itself and the whole, ransomware or the ransom process starts over again? I think that'd be pretty interesting to take a look at. And I got a quick video demo here for you. So what I did here was just create like a batch file of a whole bunch of different ransomware families, and the only 2 that I actually got to pop up was Cerber and CTB Locker. So as you can see, Cerber didn't take any time at all. As soon as I started the video there, that's when Cerber infected. Popping up HTML instructions. As you can see there, the .onion link. Early version of Cerber actually requested that you download the Tor browser. But just as you think Cerber's good, pops up another text document. It's a pretty funny thing about, they definitely want to make the victim user get those instructions. But then CTB Locker takes over, minimizes all the windows, and sets the desktop background to the instructions. Cerber comes back with HTML instructions again. And they kind of battle it out. A lot of window scripting errors going on, mainly because the infected files, they're encrypting themselves at this point. So it's kind of a race condition, which I thought was pretty fun.
Is that a good mitigation strategy, do you think?
Yeah.
As fast as you can.
Yeah.
Get infected with a bunch of
Yeah, true. Yeah, that could definitely save you in some ways. This end user obviously having a really bad day, probably calling IT right now. IT's telling them, well, have you tried turning it off and on again? Yeah.
Could one thing if this happened, you pull the power and mount it with an external operating system at disk and see what you can salvage? Is that a good strategy, if you do see something like this?
Yeah.
Catch it quickly, or?
Yeah, I don't do much IR, but that would be my approach to it. I wouldn't try to,
Hit power,
yeah.
never boot it up unless it's, just mounted externally.
We do IR, we have done IR on that, so you get the message after the problem, but, so
Right.
if you get the message, you're already done.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Do you have an idea of how much money they're making?
It's very debated. There was like a FBI release, I think it was a week or two ago, and I don't know if it was Locky actors that they were talking about, but they said it could have been as high as $1 million a day sold from that, which
From what I've read, everything that I've seen says that that's very overinflated.
yeah, can be overinflated, that's for sure. There has been a lot of tracking. Since this is Bitcoin, there has been some researchers that have been tracking blockchain transactions, and even then, some of the earlier CryptoWall research that came out about blockchain tracking, they suggested anywhere between like $200,000 to $400,000 a day US. So very high numbers. Yep.
Is there a reason they're not using more improvements into?
Probably just they don't care. I mean, it's working, so why change it? That can be my own loss. I mean, these, not to get in like psychological profiling of these guys, but I mean, the reason why they're doing this, it's a quick buck. They're lazy. So you do see that sometimes in their programming methodologies and also in their infrastructure. They're not really taking the time for property. Sometimes proper OpSec, but more along the lines of quality assurance for the code.
Well, they're also, if they're using 20 to 40 different sites a day, then you don't want to get into certificate management for all of them. It's easier just to use HTTP.
Yeah, yeah, and most of those they're being hosted on compromised websites. So user websites that, exist in like large server farms where you might have hundreds, if not thousands of websites per IP address. So they figure by utilizing that as a second stage payload, those are going to be allowed through firewalls and whatever, and then setting up a Nginx proxy with proper SSLP management.
One of the things we've noticed is that they'll actually use a custom encryption scheme or 443, so it'll go through the proxies, if you don't have SSL inspections or not, the proxy just forwards it because it knows it can't see anything at 443. If you've got Fiddler or Wireshark running, it's all encrypted, and unless you've got the key, you can't see it.
Yeah.
Or like less encrypted. I'm surprised less encrypted and more utilized for
Yeah,
that stuff.
utilize for abuse, yeah. Cool. Any other questions? Good? Y'all about hungry?
Yeah.
I know I am. I think we had one announcement real quick.